They told her to stand down. They told her this mission was a death sentence. They said no pilot in history had survived that canyon. So she broke every rule, stole an Apache at 03:27 a.m., and flew headfirst into hell. She didn't come back alone. She came back dragging the enemy's nightmare behind her. Welcome to Quiet Tales Studio. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? Hit that subscribe button and join our community. We're growing every day, and your support helps us bring you these incredible stories of heroism that deserve to be told. Now prepare yourself for a story that will leave you breathless, about a pilot who turned the impossible into inevitable. Fort Bragg's briefing room felt like a tomb at 100 hours. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the faces of 12 elite Apache pilots seated in rigid attention. The air was thick with tension and the metallic taste of fear. Colonel James Reinhardt stood at the front, his weathered face grim as granite. Behind him, satellite imagery flickered on multiple screens. Aerial shots of a godforsaken canyon in hostile territory that looked like the entrance to hell itself. "Gentlemen," Reinhardt's voice cut through the silence like a blade. At 0400 hours, Recon Team Delta went dark in the Coast Valley. 27 of our finest trapped behind enemy lines. SAM sites confirmed. Heavy artillery, air defenses that have already claimed 3 drones. He clicked to the next slide. Red dots peppered the canyon walls like a constellation of death. Mission parameters are simple. Extract all personnel. Problem is, Reinhardt paused, his eyes scanning the room. Every simulation shows a 97% casualty rate for any aircraft entering that valley. The canyon walls create a natural kill box. No escape routes, no cover, no backup. Captain Lila Monroe sat in the third row, her green eyes locked on the imagery. At 29, she was the youngest pilot in the room and the only woman. 5 tours in Afghanistan, 847 combat hours, 0 losses. Major Rick Thompson, a 15-year veteran sitting to her left, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with respect, this isn't a rescue mission. It's a suicide run." Murmurs rippled through the room. Heads nodded in agreement. "Anyone disagree?" Reinhardt asked. Silence. Monroe's hand twitched, but she kept it at her side. She'd seen those terrain maps before, studied them during her downtime. The Coast Valley was a pilot's nightmare, narrow, winding, surrounded by peaks that channeled aircraft into predetermined kill zones. But she'd also seen something the others missed. A flight path. Dangerous, insane, requiring precision that bordered on supernatural, but possible. "No volunteers," Reinhardt concluded. "Mission scrubbed. Those men are on their own." The room began to empty. Pilots filed out, relief visible on their faces. Monroe remained seated, staring at the screens. "Captain," Reinhardt called. "Something to add?" Monroe stood slowly. "Sir, sometimes doing what's right means breaking what's safe." Reinhardt's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "The mission isn't impossible. It's just never been attempted by someone crazy enough to try." "And you think you're that crazy?" Monroe's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Sir, I don't think. I know." Hangar 6 stood silent at 0300 hours, its cavernous interior lit only by emergency lighting. The AH-64D Apache longbow sitting in the center looked like a sleeping predator, all sharp angles, weapon systems, and lethal potential. Monroe approached it slowly, running her hands along the fuselage. Every Apache had a personality, a feel. This one hummed with barely contained violence. "You talking to yourself or the bird?" Monroe turned to find Chief Warrant Officer Maria Santos approaching, flight gear in hand. Santos was 32, compact and fierce, with reflexes that had saved both their lives on more occasions than either cared to count. "Didn't expect company," Monroe said. "Didn't expect you to steal an Apache without your best gunner," Santos replied, climbing into the cockpit. "Besides, someone needs to keep you from getting us both killed." Monroe smiled genuinely for the first time in hours. "Missions unauthorized. We get caught, it's court-martial. We don't get caught, it's medals." Santos began her pre-flight checks. "Either way beats sitting on our asses while good men die." Monroe settled into the pilot's seat, her fingers dancing across familiar controls. The Apache's systems came alive with soft electronic chirps and glowing displays. "Weapons status?" she asked. "Full load. Hellfire missiles, Hydra rockets, 30mm chain gun, enough firepower to level a city block." "Flight path programmed?" "Nap of the Earth to avoid radar, but Monroe..." Santos paused. "The approach vector you've plotted? It requires flying inverted through a canyon pass barely wider than our rotor span." "I've done it before, in simulation." "Simulation doesn't shoot back." Monroe's hands found the collective and cyclic controls. The Apache's rotors began their slow rotation, building to a thunderous whine. "Guardian 1 to tower," she spoke into her headset, knowing no one would answer. "Unauthorized takeoff. Pattern is closed." The Apache lifted into the night sky, nose dropping as Monroe pushed it into forward flight. Below, Fort Bragg disappeared into darkness. They were committed now. The flight to Coast Valley took 47 minutes of low-level navigation through hostile airspace. Monroe kept the Apache at 150 feet, weaving between hills and following dry riverbeds to avoid detection. At 0427 hours, the valley mouth appeared ahead, a black gash in the mountainside that seemed to swallow starlight. "Contact on scope," Santos reported. "Multiple SAM sites, active radar. They know we're coming." "Let them know," Monroe replied, pushing the Apache into a steep dive toward the canyon floor. The first missile launch lit up the night like a deadly firework. Monroe rolled left, flares bursting from the Apache's countermeasure dispensers in a brilliant cascade. The SAM streaked past, close enough to feel its heat through the cockpit glass. "That was close," Santos muttered. "That was practice," Monroe replied. She dropped the Apache to 30 feet above the canyon floor, using the terrain to mask their approach. Rock walls flashed past on either side, close enough to touch. The radio crackled with desperate voices. Any station, this is Recon Delta. We are taking heavy fire and need immediate extraction." "Recon Delta, this is Guardian 1, Monroe responded. "En route to your position. Prepare for pickup." "Guardian 1, you are not authorized for this operation. Abort immediately." "Can't hear you, Delta. Bad connection." Monroe killed the radio and focused on flying. The canyon narrowed ahead, forcing her into a knife-edge maneuver between stone walls. The Apache's rotor tips cleared the rocks by inches. Santos checked her weapons systems. "Multiple hostile signatures ahead. Looks like they've got the LZ locked down tight." Then we unlock it. The landing zone appeared around the next bend, a small clearing surrounded by burning vehicles and scattered equipment. 27 soldiers in various states of injury huddled behind inadequate cover as enemy fire poured down from the surrounding ridges. There, Santos pointed to a cluster of muzzle flashes on the eastern ridge. Heavy machine gun nest, range 800 meters. Monroe brought the Apache into a hover, presenting a stable firing platform. Light them up. Santos's first Hellfire missile streaked across the canyon, impacting the machine gun position in a ball of orange flame. Secondary explosions indicated stored ammunition. Direct hit. That ridge is quiet. But 3 more positions opened fire immediately. Tracer rounds filled the air like deadly fireflies, some impacting the Apache's armored hull with metallic pings. Monroe maneuvered aggressively, never presenting the same target twice. Santos engaged each hostile position in turn, her gunnery precise and devastating. "LZ is clear," she announced, "for now." Monroe settled the Apache onto the rocky ground. Soldiers ran from cover, 8 at a time, the maximum the aircraft could carry. "Load up," Monroe shouted over the rotor noise. The first 8 soldiers piled in, their faces showing relief and disbelief in equal measure. Most were wounded, all were exhausted. "Guardian 1, this is Delta Leader," the team commander spoke through the intercom. "Captain Sarah Chen, Marines, you pilots are either heroes or completely insane." "Both," Monroe replied, pulling pitch to lift off. "Hold tight." The flight out was a running firefight. Enemy forces had repositioned during the Apache's ground time, setting up new firing positions along the canyon walls. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past the cockpit, missing by feet. "RPG, 9 o'clock, Santos called. Monroe jinked right, the Apache's airframe groaning under the G-forces. Behind them, more missiles launched from hidden positions. "Flares! Flares!" Santos shouted. Countermeasures burst around the Apache like a deadly light show. Most of the incoming missiles were decoyed away, but one SAM stayed locked on target. "It's tracking through the flares," Santos reported. "Impact in 5 seconds." Monroe rolled the Apache inverted and dove toward the canyon floor, using the terrain to break the missile's lock. The SAM exploded against the rock wall above them, showering debris. "That was too close," one of the rescued soldiers muttered. "Gets easier after the first dozen times," Monroe replied, pulling the Apache back to level flight. They cleared the canyon mouth and turned toward friendly territory. In the cargo bay, medics worked on the wounded while the others watched the canyon disappear behind them. "Guardian 1 to Fort Bragg Medical," Monroe transmitted. 8 souls inbound, multiple casualties. ETA 15 minutes. "Roger, Guardian 1. Medical team standing by. And Captain? Colonel Reinhardt wants to see you immediately upon landing." "Tell the Colonel I'm busy." Monroe clicked the radio off and banked toward base. Round 1, complete. 26 more to go. Fort Bragg's medical facility was controlled chaos as the Apache touched down on the landing pad. Medics swarmed the aircraft, extracting wounded soldiers and rushing them toward waiting ambulances. Monroe didn't shut down the engines. "Fuel status?" she asked Santos. 60%, good for another run. "Ammunition?" "Used 2 Hellfire missiles and about 50 rounds of 30mm. Still plenty left." Colonel Reinhardt appeared at Monroe's window, his face a mask of controlled fury. She opened the cockpit door but didn't climb out. "Captain Monroe, you are in direct violation of orders. Stand down immediately." "Sir, 19 soldiers are still trapped in that canyon. They'll be dead by morning if we don't get them out." "That's not your decision to make." Monroe's eyes flashed. "It became my decision the moment you decided they were expendable." She began to close the cockpit door. Reinhardt grabbed it. "Monroe, if you take off again, it's court-martial. End of career. Do you understand?" Perfectly, sir. Monroe's voice was ice-cold calm. Are you going to stop me? For a long moment, they stared at each other. Finally, Reinhardt stepped back. If you die out there, I never authorized this mission. If I die out there, sir, make sure they spell my name right on the headstone. The Apache lifted off, rotors washing dust across the landing pad. Reinhardt watched until it disappeared into the darkness. The second approach to Coast Valley was different. The enemy had learned from the first encounter, repositioning their defenses and setting up new ambush points. Multiple radar contacts, Santos reported. They've moved SAM sites to the valley entrance. We're flying into a box. Monroe studied the threat display. Red symbols covered the canyon mouth like a deadly web. Then we don't use the front door. She banked the Apache northwest toward a narrow side canyon barely visible on the maps. The passage was treacherous, walls so close the rotor wash echoed like thunder, but it bypassed the main defenses. Monroe, this passage isn't wide enough, Santos warned as rocks scraped against the Apache's hull. It is if we make it wide enough. Monroe fired the 30mm chain gun at protruding rocks, blasting away obstacles. Stone fragments ricocheted off the Apache's armor as they carved their way through the passage. They emerged into the main valley behind enemy lines, catching the defenders completely off guard. They're repositioning, Santos observed, but it'll take them time. Monroe dove toward the landing zone. The remaining soldiers were in worse shape than the first group, more wounded, ammunition nearly gone, some unconscious from blood loss. The Apache touched down and immediately took fire from a new position. "Sniper on the north ridge," Santos called. "He's got us ranged." Bullets sparked off the Apache's armored glass as soldiers ran for the aircraft. Monroe kept the engines at full power, ready to lift off instantly. 7 soldiers made it aboard before the sniper found his mark. A round punched through the Apache's side window, missing Monroe's head by inches. "That's it," Monroe snarled. Santos put a hellfire up his nose. The missile streaked across the valley, turning the sniper's position into a crater. But the explosion triggered an avalanche of loose rock that began cascading toward the landing zone. "Move! Move!" Monroe shouted, pulling pitch just as tons of stone crashed into the area they'd occupied seconds before. The Apache struggled to climb with the additional weight, but Monroe coaxed every ounce of performance from the machine. 12 more to go, she announced to no one in particular. The third extraction run began with ominous warning lights on the Apache's instrument panel. "Engine temperature climbing," Santos reported. "Oil pressure dropping in engine 2. "How long do we have?" "Maybe an hour, less if we push it hard." Monroe gritted her teeth. An hour meant one more trip, possibly 2 if they were lucky. 12 soldiers would have to wait. "We make this count," she decided. The approach was routine until they reached the canyon mouth. This time, the enemy was ready with a new surprise, a hidden anti-aircraft gun that opened fire the moment the Apache appeared. 20mm shells filled the air around them. One round punched through the Apache's tail boom, damaging the tail rotor drive system. "Tail rotor losing effectiveness," Monroe reported as the aircraft began to yaw uncontrollably. "I'm losing directional control." She fought the controls, using engine torque and forward airspeed to maintain stability. The Apache wallowed through the air like a wounded animal, but it stayed airborne. "Can you still land?" Santos asked. "I can land. Getting back up might be interesting." They reached the LZ, and Monroe set the Apache down hard, the aircraft bouncing twice before settling. 8 more soldiers scrambled aboard, including 3 stretcher cases. "That's all the critical wounded," Captain Chen reported. "The remaining 4 are mobile and can wait." Monroe tried to lift off and immediately knew they were in trouble. The damaged tail rotor couldn't provide enough anti-torque, causing the Apache to spin slowly to the right. "I can't maintain heading, Sid," she announced. "We're going to have to make this interesting." She flew the Apache in a series of S-turns, using forward airspeed and engine power changes to control their direction. It was exhausting, requiring constant attention, but it worked. They limped back to Fort Bragg, landing heavily on the medical pad. Ground crews immediately swarmed the aircraft, assessing damage. "How long for repairs?" Monroe asked the crew chief. 4 hours minimum, Captain. That tail rotor gearbox is shot." Monroe looked back at the canyon, where 4 soldiers waited in the darkness. "Find another bird," she told Santos. "There aren't any others configured for this mission." Monroe walked to the edge of the landing pad, staring into the night. 4 men, 4 lives hanging in the balance. Behind her, Santos approached quietly. "Monroe, you've done everything possible. No one expects you to. I expect me to." At 0630 hours, as dawn broke over Fort Bragg, Monroe stood before a different Apache, an older model with fewer defensive systems but functional tail rotor. "This bird's not configured for night operations," the crew chief warned. "No thermal imaging, limited countermeasures." "Then we do it old school," Monroe replied. Santos joined her, despite Monroe's protests. "You're not flying alone. End of discussion." The final approach to Coast Valley was surreal in the early morning light. Smoke still rose from the previous night's battle, and the canyon walls showed fresh scars from explosions. 4 contacts on the LZ, Santos reported, all mobile, moving to the pickup point. But as they descended, new threat warnings appeared on their displays. "Multiple missile launches," Santos shouted. "They've been waiting for us." The enemy had used the night to position every available weapon system around the landing zone. SAMs, RPGs, and heavy machine guns opened fire simultaneously. Monroe threw the Apache into violent evasive maneuvers, but without advanced countermeasures, they were vulnerable. An RPG exploded off the port side, peppering the cockpit with shrapnel. Santos cried out as fragments cut her arm. "I'm okay," she said through gritted teeth. "Keep flying." Monroe brought the Apache into the LZ under heavy fire. The 4 remaining soldiers sprinted from cover, diving into the aircraft as bullets whined overhead. "Go! Go! Go!" one of them shouted. Monroe pulled pitch, but the overloaded Apache responded sluggishly. They cleared the ground by inches, climbing slowly as enemy fire intensified. A heavy machine gun found its mark, stitching rounds across the Apache's belly. Warning lights blazed as systems failed. "Hydraulic failure," Santos reported. "Flight controls going to manual backup." The Apache became twice as hard to fly, requiring all of Monroe's strength to maintain control. Her arms burned with fatigue as she muscled the aircraft through the canyon. They cleared the valley mouth just as the engine fire warning illuminated. "Engine 2 shutting down," Monroe announced. "We're flying on 1 engine." The Apache limped toward Fort Bragg, losing altitude steadily. Monroe calculated distance versus descent rate and realized they might not make it. "Emergency services on standby," Santos radioed. "We're coming in hard." In the cargo bay, the rescued soldiers watched tensely as the ground rose to meet them. No one spoke, but everyone understood. They were riding in a machine held together by skill and determination. The Fort Bragg runway appeared ahead, emergency vehicles lining both sides. "I've got it," Monroe said softly, more to herself than anyone else. The Apache touched down with jarring force, bounced once, and settled onto the tarmac. Steam rose from the overheated engine as Monroe finally shut down the systems. Silence filled the cockpit. 27 souls, Santos said quietly. 27 souls, Monroe agreed. Colonel Reinhardt was waiting as Monroe and Santos climbed out of the Apache. His expression was unreadable, but the cluster of high-ranking officers behind him suggested this wasn't a social visit. Captain Monroe, Chief Warrant Officer Santos, he began formally, you are under arrest for violation of direct orders, theft of military property, and unauthorized combat operations. Military police stepped forward with handcuffs. Monroe stood at attention, accepting responsibility. Sir, the decision was mine alone. Chief Santos was following my lead. Like hell, Santos interjected. I volunteered for this mission. Before Reinhardt could respond, a commotion erupted from the medical facility. The 27 rescued soldiers, led by Captain Chen, approached in formation. Colonel, Chen called out, requesting permission to speak. Reinhardt hesitated, then nodded. Chen stepped forward. Sir, these officers violated orders to save American lives. They flew into hell and brought us home. If you're arresting them, you'll have to arrest all of us for requesting the mission. The other rescued soldiers moved to flank Monroe and Santos, creating a human barrier between them and the military police. Stand down, Reinhardt ordered. All of you. No, sir, Chen replied respectfully. Not until you hear what these pilots did. Not until you understand that breaking bad orders to save good lives isn't a crime. It's what we swore to do when we put on these uniforms. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Reinhardt dismissed the military police with a gesture. Captain Monroe, Chief Santos, he said slowly, report to my office at 0800 tomorrow. We have a lot to discuss. As the crowd dispersed, Reinhardt approached Monroe privately. You know this can't go unpunished, he said quietly. I know, sir. You also know that 27 families are going to sleep well tonight because of what you did. Monroe met his gaze. That's all that matters, sir. Reinhardt nodded once, then walked away. 6 months later, Captain Lila Monroe stood before another briefing room, this time at the Pentagon. The walls were lined with distinguished service crosses, silver stars, and other decorations earned by pilots who'd pushed the boundaries of the possible. General Patricia Hayes, the first female chief of staff of the Army, addressed the assembled audience of military leadership and media. The events in Coast Valley represent everything we value in military service: courage, dedication, and the willingness to sacrifice personal safety for the greater good. She turned to Monroe, who stood at attention in her dress uniform. Captain Monroe, your actions that night saved 27 lives and demonstrated that sometimes the right choice isn't the easy choice, or even the legal choice. Your court-martial proceedings resulted in a formal reprimand and loss of 2 months' pay. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the audience. However, General Hayes continued, it is my honor to also present you with a Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat operations. The audience erupted in applause as Hayes pinned the medal to Monroe's uniform. Santos, also being decorated, stood beside her. After the ceremony, Monroe was approached by a young female cadet. Ma'am, the cadet said nervously, I want to be a pilot like you someday. Monroe smiled. Then remember this. The machines we fly are impressive, but they're just metal and electronics. What makes the difference is the person in the cockpit, and the choices they make when everything is on the line. What if I make the wrong choice? Then you learn from it and make a better choice next time. But if you have to choose between following orders and saving lives, Monroe paused, looking out the window at the helicopters on the distant flight line. Sometimes breaking the rules is the most important thing you can do. The cadet saluted and walked away, inspiration evident in her stride. Santos appeared beside Monroe. "Ready for the next mission?" Monroe grinned. "Always am. What have we got?" "Classified. High risk. Probably impossible." "Sounds perfect." Together, they walked toward the flight line where their Apache waited. The same bird they'd stolen that night in Hangar 6, now officially assigned to their new unit, a special operations squadron that handled missions too dangerous or politically sensitive for regular forces. The nameplate on the aircraft's nose read Guardian 1, and below it, in smaller letters, "Rules are guidelines." Captain Lila Monroe climbed into the pilot seat and began her pre-flight checks. Somewhere in the world, someone needed saving. Someone was counting on pilots crazy enough to fly into hell and bring them home. The Apache's rotors began to turn, and Monroe smiled. It was going to be a good day to fly. This story was brought to you by Quiet Tales Studio. If you believe in the courage to do what's right, even when it means breaking what's safe, subscribe to our channel and join our community of storytellers. Where are you watching from today? Tell us in the comments about someone you know who broke the rules to save lives. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most important missions are the ones nobody authorizes, and the greatest heroes are the ones who act when everyone else says it's impossible. Subscribe to Quiet Tales Studio, where the most powerful stories come from the quiet courage of extraordinary people.